Well, all right, I reckon it's time we talked about the experience of black Americans in the period from 1800 to 1848. So if you're ready to get them brain cows milked, let's get to it. Okay, so let's begin by setting the stage and thinking about continuity and change during this period. Now, here's where I tell you that most of the founders, even those who owned enslaved people like Thomas Jefferson and George Washington, believed that slavery was an institution unbecoming of a free nation. I mean, everyone was running around crying liberty, and it felt just a little, ill-fitting that such a large population of the United States was enslaved. But even so, they made almost no efforts to legally abolish the institution, since they held a firm conviction that with the banning of the international slave trade in 1808 and the eventual exhaustion of southern soil by cotton cultivation, slavery would essentially abolish itself. Oh, so naive. So in terms of continuity, slavery remained a significant institution present in early 19th century America. Oh, and by the way, if you want Noteguides to follow along with this video and all my videos, check the link in the description. But change was also afoot, my dear pupil. In the North, a growing abolitionist movement led to the banning of slavery in all northern states, some of which mandated immediate abolition while others allowed for gradual emancipation. Now, I am in no way poo-pooing such an effort. No, abolition in any form gets all the thumbs up from me. But I need to mention that abolishing slavery in the North wasn't the heaviest lift, since their enslaved population was very small and they in no way relied on slavery for economic flourishing. It's kind of like if a person has never gotten drunk in their lives because they just don't like the taste of alcohol, then their sobriety is not really a virtue, it's just a preference that costs them very little. But at least some efforts to abolish slavery in the North were surely a moral crusade, especially the abolitionist Christian denominations that embraced the impulse for social reform as a result of the Second Great Awakening. And then to further complicate the issue, while the North was getting itself all free of slavery and wagging its moralistic finger at the backward Southern slaveholders, they apparently felt just fine importing metric buttloads of Southern cotton into their factories that had been processed by the enslaved. But in the South, we see a very different reality. You see, while the Northern economy was almost entirely centered on industrial manufacturing, the Southern economy was entirely centered on agriculture, and specifically the growth and export of cotton. Now, the cultivation of cotton required massive tracts of land and a whole lot of human labor to plant and harvest. And so at the very same time that northern states were abolishing slavery, southern states were becoming even more entrenched in the institution, since their very livelihood depended on its perpetuation. And in order to do this, slaveholders increasingly relied on and perpetuated several justifications for slavery in order to make the brutal institution more palatable. And chief among these arguments was to frame slavery as a positive good rather than a necessary evil, and to argue that enslaved labor was superior to wage slavery in the North. We'll talk all about that in the next video, so for now, I'll leave it there. Okay, now we'll come back to slavery in a minute, but first let me tell you about the population of free blacks during this period. Now, it might surprise you to hear that the free black populations in both the North and the South were roughly equal in number, but their experiences were different. So in the North, many free blacks lived in cities where they were able to own land and live together in families. However, even though the North was boiling with anti-slavery movements, that did not necessarily translate into equal rights for free blacks. So if in your mind you think of northern states during this period as a shining beacon of liberty and equality for black people, well, you're gonna need to go ahead and shut that all the way down. In fact, for a substantial portion of abolitionists, their main concern was not encouraging equality between white and black Americans, but rather their main concern was economics. What I mean is, many abolitionists believed that the perpetuation of enslaved labor challenged the viability of free wage labor, which was predominant in the North. In fact, one of the most prominent features of the abolitionist movement was the formation of the American Colonization Society. And basically, this organization argued that since black and white people were in fact not equal and could never coexist, let's establish a colony in Africa, namely Liberia, and just send all the black people there. And you know, that logic kind of resembled a kid capturing a cricket and putting it in a jar with some leaves and a stick. And that kid pats himself on the back and says, "Oh, little Randy is just gonna love his natural environment and thrive for the rest of his days." No, for the most part, the only people who were excited about sending black people back to Africa, to a place where almost none of them were actually from, were white people. So all that to say, yes, free blacks in the North enjoyed more freedom than their counterparts in the South, but they were in no way enjoying the fullness of their civil rights. Even so, many free blacks came together to create their own social institutions, like for example the predominantly black African Methodist Episcopal Church. Anyway, in the South, most of the free black population also lived in cities, though they had to deal with the constant fears of being kidnapped and forced into slavery. Additionally, state laws banned them from voting and restricted the kinds of occupations available to them. Okay, and now let's consider how black Americans resisted the dehumanizing effects of slavery, and I'll mention three distinct categories. First, enslaved blacks engaged in covert resistance, which means it was kind of undercover. For example, enslaved Americans took pains to maintain their own culture. In some cases, though their white owners gave them Christian names, they used names of West African descent out of the hearing of their masters. In other cases, they kept their traditions alive through traditional African music played on African instruments and told each other traditional folk tales from their homeland. Or another example, enslaved people resisted bondage by breaking tools and slowing down their work. It meant at the very least that the planter who enslaved them would not enjoy as much profit as he would if the work was at full speed. And then the second category here is overt resistance, and in this case we're talking about rebellion that was out in the open for all to see, and I'll give you two notable examples. First, let's talk talk about Nat Turner's rebellion in 1831. Now, perhaps the deepest fear among white enslavers was the persistent threat of slave rebellion. I mean, the fact that the Haitian Revolution was successful in killing and driving out the island's white slave masters, and the memory of the Stono Rebellion only stoked this abiding fear. And then in 1831, a new slave rebellion erupted in Virginia that proved that they were right to be afraid. So Nat Turner was an enslaved man who, in the opinion of his enslavers, had been happy and content with his lot in life. But Turner developed the idea that he was a religious prophet whom God had charged with a mission to emancipate the enslaved through violence. And so in 1831, Turner gathered his followers by night and killed the white family who claimed ownership over him, and then proceeded to kill more than 50 white men, women, and children in the surrounding area. Now, the rebellion was quickly put down by the Virginia militia, but this event struck deep fear within the southern white planters. As a result, states across the South imposed much harsher slave codes meant to restrict and control its enslaved populations. But at the same time, measures were also taken to regulate some of the brutal treatment of the enslaved so that they wouldn't feel the need to rebel so dang much. That wily planter elite just couldn't be too careful about keeping the balance between abject dehumanization of the enslaved and keeping them happy enough to be content. And spoiler alert, that is a balance that cannot be kept on account of the enslaved people didn't seem to be content with any amount of dehumanization. Okay, and then the second example of overt resistance was the Amistad case in 1841, which further stoked southern fears of enslaved rebellion. So long story short, in 1839, enslaved men aboard a Spanish ship killed the captain and took control of the vessel. And then the US Navy intercepted the ship and imprisoned the rebels, but due to international treaties outlawing slavery and abolitionist pressure, the case of these enslaved mutineers came before the US federal courts. Now, John Quincy Adams enlisted himself to represent the Africans and argued for their freedom. When the case came before the Supreme Court, the decision indeed freed these men. And Northern abolitionists considered this decision a win, but Southerners were outraged that the court would overstep its authority by freeing enslaved people. And so at the end of the day, both Nat Turner's rebellion and the Amistad case only deepened the tension and animosity between the North and the South. Okay, and then the last category of resistance includes various political efforts toward abolition. So in 1848, a new effort to organize a political movement against slavery emerged with the Free Soil Convention. Frederick Douglass, who famously broke with William Lloyd Garrison over the efficacy of political action against slavery, joined the movement believing that a new political party could make significant changes to slavery in America. And ultimately, these efforts led to the creation of a new political party known as the Free Soil Party. And in line with what I mentioned earlier, this party didn't really focus on the moral depravity of slavery, but rather they focused on more practical matters like guarding Western territories against the spread of slavery so that white workers could continue to find opportunities on the frontier. But even so, Douglass was a practical man and could see that if a candidate from the Free Soil Party won, it would mean that the sun was setting on American slavery. Well, okay, click here to watch my other videos from Unit 4 and click here to grab my video note guides, which are going to help you get all the contents of this course firmly crammed into your brain folds. I'm glad you came around, and I'll catch you on the flip-flop. Heimler out.